Hello and welcome to the KimIversen Show. Thank you so much for being here. So many are worried about a rising China and what it means for the United States. Our guest today co-authored what I would say is an extremely comprehensive book called Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. The book is well written. The authors are extremely intelligent. I agree with them on some aspects. I disagree with them on other aspects. Let me just read a little bit from it so that you can get a clear idea of what we're going to be talking about and really debating today. The greatest betrayal in history has been that of the American and Chinese people by the American elite in league with the Chinese Communist Party. Wall Street and pro-engagement experts in government have funded and supported the CCP for decades. That support kept the CCP in power and empowered their illegitimate and tyrannical rule to continue and sustain the appalling abuses of the Chinese people. That support also gave rise to the greatest external threat the United States has ever faced, as year after year, the People's Republic of China's military grew stronger, and their threat to America's national security and our allies grew greater and more immediate. It goes on to say that the study provides immediate steps to take to address that threat. And that's from the foreword of the book that was actually written by Steve Bannon. Like I said, I agree on some aspects of their concerns, but not on others. We're going to be talking to Bradley Thayer today, one of the co-authors. Bradley Thayer is a founding member of the Committee on Present Danger China and is a former visiting fellow at Magdalen College at the University of Oxford. As I said, these guys are very smart. So this should be an interesting conversation. Very much looking forward to it. Bradley Thayer, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
So I have to say, I haven't had the chance to read this entire book that you've written, but I have read segments of it. I found it to be quite comprehensive. There's a lot of books out there about China and on this particular subject that kind of gloss over the surface, I feel like, or don't really get into the deep arguments. And I feel like this was very different from that. It was more written like there was constantly a reference to a study. What was the study? Can you clarify that?
Well, certainly the study is the book.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, we just
Okay, because it
we just
read
don't
like
want to
a
say this book argues. Occasionally, we'll say the study argues.
got it. Okay, because it really was like a study. I mean, as far as how deep it goes into the history, where we're at today, and where the United States should go from here. So you argue in this, your argument is that the United States has underestimated the threat from China, that China poses, would you say, an existential threat to the United States?
Yes, my co-author James Fennell and I make that argument that the People's Republic of China does indeed pose an existential threat to the United States. And as we argue in the book, of course, too, we explain why that's a tragedy. It didn't have to happen, that the People's Republic of China did not have to become the size, the scope, the depth of the threat to the United States, to the American homeland, to American national security interests, to our allies and partners around the world. And we really have ourselves to blame for that, right? It was our greatest strategic failure was to assist, very actively assist the rise of our peer competitor, the People's Republic of China, an existential enemy of the US.
Okay, so let's get into the background. When did this begin? Let's start from the beginning of when China started rising to this point. Now, I have to say, we're going to agree on some things. We're going to disagree on some things on this. I certainly agree that the United States has really dropped the ball economically, that we have just outsourced all of our resources. We really felt that. I felt like during the pandemic
Yeah.
when we were extremely reliant on China and even just other foreign countries, but majority China, because they're the ones who manufactured most of the stuff for a long time, that put us into a serious national security situation that I think absolutely needs to be corrected. And it was a giant mistake for everything to be offshored. So I agree on the economics of it. I agree that America is way too much up for sale. And we're going to get into this. The military stuff, the strategic stuff on the military front and on, the abuses of Chinese people or something like that. I don't think we're going to agree on that. So I want to start with that. But I want to get into but I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation. So let's start from the beginning of when China started to rise and what the United States reaction was to that. Like, what would you say, when did this start? 30 years ago?
This started in the wake of the early 1990s. After the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, Deng Xiaoping recognized how supremely vulnerable communist China was to American pressure. If you'll recall, of course, in 1989, that was a momentous year
Hmm.
where communism in Central and Eastern Europe, and then even in the Soviet Union, it started to unravel. So Deng Xiaoping recognized he had a profound problem and that his regime was under threat. So he took a variety of measures, beginning really in the early 1990s with what he called a 24 character strategy, which we call in the book the hide and bide strategy, where Deng Xiaoping said, what we're going to do is we're going to grow intentionally. We're going to do our utmost to reform our economy, adopt capitalism
Hmm.
in essence. Although, of course, it was never truly capitalism, it's always under communist control. But we're going to adopt many of those principles and we're going to use our wealth really to influence directly American decision making, American politicians, American media, foundations, of course, Congress. And so that was Deng's strategy. So it was a very clever political warfare strategy that he recognized that he could make US businesses his partner and then he could use through U.S. businesses as well as his own efforts, he could gain political influence in the United States. And then the United States really, it takes two to tango, of course. He couldn't
Hmm.
do this by himself. It was the Clinton administration, after two very good years, where the Clinton administration had linked most favored nation trade status and linked it to an annual renewal process. So China just didn't get an automatic renewal in its most favored trade status. Clinton, with actually Nancy Pelosi driving this very significantly when she was a young congresswoman, right, essentially, was very supportive of human rights in China. So Pelosi wanted that link to human rights because she wanted to use trade as a cudgel to force political reform in the People's Republic of China. After 2 years, and you may recall in the 1992 campaign, the Clinton Gore campaign accused George Herbert Walker Bush of coddling dictators from Baghdad to Beijing,
Hmm.
right? Saddam Hussein as well as Deng Xiaoping. Uh, the Clinton administration reversed itself and put the removed human rights from it and put the PRC on the course really to what happened in December of 2001, Beijing's entrance to the World Trade Organization. And that was rocket fuel, of course, right? That greatly facilitated growth of a Chinese economy. So in the book, our central question is this: how did this happen? How could China go from about 0.6% of world gross domestic product in 1990 to before COVID, essentially an estimated about 18%
Hmm.
of world gross domestic product? So in 30 years, right, China went from an insignificant, certainly not even a great power economically, to producing about one fifth, if you will, of the world's economy. That is a remarkable change, right? That is a tremendous growth. And our answer is, well, Deng Xiaoping was one of the greatest strategists, if not the greatest strategist of the 20th century. And that he was able to bring this about, something only Bismarck had done really in the century before. And even Deng's accomplishment is more significant than Bismarck's. But it was the U.S. that made it possible. It was the U.S. that facilitated the rise of its peer competitor, and that requires an explanation. And that requires, we argue in the book, of course, accountability
Hmm.
for those who made that possible and the consequences of that, which include, as you said, the fact that our medicines, our antibiotics, personal protective equipment, as we found out in 2020, are made in China. and China could use those as a weapon against us should they so choose.
Yeah.
So that's the essence of the book.
Okay. Um, do you so if had America not stepped in and done trade deals and decided to allow open business with China, what do you think should have happened instead, and what kind of consequences would that have had on the Chinese people? Now, I'm America first. I'm all about being, for Americans for sure. But I'm also humane, and I think when we talk about the humanitarian, if we're going to go into that argument, which I think is, by the way, I don't like the idea of warfare or keeping regimes down because of humanitarian issues. I think that has been used in a way to constantly keep us at war. That is what the Democrats are doing right now when it comes to Ukraine. It's all about human rights. It's all, we have to spread democracy and, these types of arguments. I just say, let those people deal with that themselves. They're strong, they're capable, they're able. But from a humanitarian perspective, I certainly don't want people wallowing in poverty because of policies enacted by my country. I don't want people to suffer around the world because my country makes them suffer. I want my country to focus on me as an American, but I think part of that is not pissing the world off. I mean, we're 330 million people. The world is 7 billion strong. If we are hell bent on being dominant, and in so attempting to be dominant, squashing everybody else, we will not remain dominant for long. And I think that's exactly why we're in the situation we're in right now, where we're losing our dominance because nobody likes us anymore. They think we're mean, we're bullies, we keep people down, we blow people up, or we starve them. That's not a good strategy for maintaining dominance in a world that is way more populated than our country. So I guess when we go back to that beginning time, what do you think should have been done, and what kind of consequences would that have had on that 1.3 billion people?
The best thing that could have happened for the Chinese people is not economic growth, which certainly has occurred. It would have been to get rid of the Chinese Communist Party, and it would be to free the Chinese people from that. We can look to Taiwan, right? Taiwan shows what the People's Republic of China could be.
Mm-hmm.
A vibrant democracy, a vibrant economy, incredible democracy, with government, obviously, that is respectful of human rights for the Taiwanese people. If the Bush administration, that would be George Herbert Walker Bush, and the Clinton administration had put pressure on Deng Xiaoping to greatly reform the Chinese Communist Party or to evict it from power, as had fallen in Central and Eastern Europe, as we referenced, and then, of course, in the Soviet Union in 1991, what you would have been a unique Chinese political entity, right? I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese would take their own path, but freed from communism, right? The from the tyranny of the Communist Party, the people of China would be infinitely better off than they are today. So,
But why do you think that, when today the Chinese people are thriving? I mean, when you go over and you look at, I mean, we cannot lie to ourselves anymore. They are thriving. I mean, if you do the average person can't travel to China, fine. But what you can do is get on YouTube and do the walking tours of their cities, just the random walking tours where no one's talking, no one's indoctrinating you. They're just literally walking around the towns. I mean, their infrastructure is way advanced compared to ours. I mean, we're a crumbling country. We're old. We're becoming like the new Europe in a way, with old buildings that we never rebuild. And they've got like incredible infrastructure. They're rapidly same thing with the 30 years. I mean, a 30-year climb, like you said, for them to go from where they were to where they are today in that short amount of time is a phenomenal feat. And they did it under that communist regime. So I don't know if they would agree, right? I mean, I'm sure the average. So that I mean, I think they're sitting there thinking, I think we're fine. We're now able to feed ourselves. We're now out of poverty rapidly. Like, this has helped us get to this point.
right. But I think two major points there. First, this growth was done with our money, all right? Our
Right.
investment, knowledge, technology transfer from the West, South Korea, Japan, into China, and which still continues. You might have seen Mike Gallagher's committee, Chairman Mike Gallagher, And the House China Committee released a report today, February 8th, showing that in having looked into this, $3 billion in venture capital funds have been flowing into China. We do about $750 billion annually in trade
Yeah.
with China. So it was our knowledge, our technology. It was the ability to transfer that. It was the fact that we outsourced our manufacturing
Right.
to China, right? In Ohio, Indiana, of course, Wisconsin, so many areas were adversely affected by those decisions of essentially offshoring. Second point, so we did it, right? I mean, it was, yes, the incredibly impressive in terms of what China has accomplished. But they wouldn't have done it without us,
Hmm.
certainly. What broadly, the U.S., the West, of course, Japan, South Korea,
Right,
very
but
important.
you could make that same argument with about Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, for example. I mean, these were countries that remained. They became maybe after during we
Mhm,
basically got in there. We'd had a lot of business trade with them. I mean, I would say that
mhm.
you can't even think that Japan for sure would and South Korea would not be where they are today had it not been greatly for American influence coming in.
Absolutely, we wrote the Japanese Constitution,
Right,
right, and the
right.
Peace Treaty of 1951. So,
So all of those countries, I mean, whether they be communist or capitalist, I guess my point is America had a great amount of influence on where
right,
they are economically today.
of the tigers, right, and we could think of the four tigers: South Korea, of course, then Singapore and Taiwan. But the second major point is South Korea became a democracy, Japan became a democracy, and China might have, the People's Republic might have become a democracy or developed its own, if you will, a traditional Chinese polity, a traditional Chinese political system that would be better. So, yes, they have the infrastructure, but they also have tyranny. They have a social credit system. They have a government which monitors them. You may recall the blank page protests to zero and resistance to zero COVID policies.
Right.
It is a government which is committing genocide against its Muslims, largely in Xinjiang, but in other provinces as well. It is a gross abuser of human rights in
But what
China.
does that matter? I
Uh,
mean, like, what is it? Because the United States doesn't demand that all of the people we do business with, we don't demand that they adopt our Constitution. We don't say you have to give the First Amendment or even the Second Amendment to the people in your countries in order for us to do business with you. So we don't ever make those types of demands for most. I mean, if sure, maybe we had some influence on some countries and their constitutions, maybe we have some shared values, but ultimately, do we have to have the same values as everybody else just to do business with them?
Mhm. Indeed, we don't. And we traded with the Soviet Union, for example. Great. So we traded. Stalin was an ally of the United States
Right, right,
during World War II. So we can go down. It's really realpolitik that explains a lot of it. Uncle Sam will make alliances with a lot of different groups. But with respect to how it matters for the Chinese people, right? It matters that you have really a wonderful, you've got Taiwan just about 110 miles from the People's Republic of China. And here again, you have that a vibrant democracy, and it came to its own path, right,
yeah,
in terms of it, and it continues to evolve, of course, as a political system and as a party. But it's fiercely democratic, as the elections on January 13th just revealed. Of course, in the People's Republic, you don't have that. So, what does it
right,
matter? It matters for the Chinese people. It matters for Muslims. It matters for those who are being abused for their human rights or because they're minorities in China. It matters because this regime is an aggressive regime. It is a regime which is remaking international politics. It's remaking the international order in a way which is very negative and defined by exploitation of people and the environment wherever it shows up, whether that's
right.
Africa, uh, Central South America, of course, Southeast Asia. So you have a regime which is very aggressive, expanding in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, a world's worst abuser of human rights today, and is remaking the international order by changing institutions that the United States created and that
Hmm.
had provided, of course, a monetary regime or a trade regime, for example, the rules of the road of international politics that were also contributed to China's rise. Well, China's also making its own institutions, right? And Belt and Road Initiative, of course,
Right.
your audience will know what that has received a tremendous amount of attention. It's doing of attention. It's essentially facilitating Chinese political influence and economic influence around the world. So we need to recognize that if you could wave a magic wand and the Communist Party of China disappears and it's replaced with a traditional Chinese polity, that would be infinitely better. And one final point, which is, of course, communism is not Chinese, right? That's a Western import.
Hmm. Yeah.
This was Marx and Engels, obviously through Lenin, and then the Communist International, right, were
Right.
heavily influential in creating and driving and ultimately contributing to the success of the Chinese Communist Party. So we need to recognize that too. It's not a legitimate form of government. And its tyranny is something which is at variance with the inclinations and of the traditions
Yeah.
of Chinese civilization. I think all of that needs to be recognized when we're reflecting on this. Yes, the infrastructure is wonderful, new, and that makes China, of course, a very dynamic power. But this is fundamentally, it is an odious regime. And it's a regime which is driving the world towards conflict with Japan, with the states of Southeast Asia. As a result of the South China Sea, it's an entity which may conquer Taiwan, right? It may be this year or next year where they aggress against Taiwan or against India
Yeah.
or
I
against the US.
Sh Sure. Well, and right, when we should always be, defending ourselves, there's no doubt about that. I mean, I wanna make something really, really clear just so that with people watching aren't gonna say, "Oh, Kim's a big commie apologist," or something like that. I am absolutely not. My family fled communism. I'm Vietnamese. My family left Vietnam. Half of my family stayed in Vietnam. So I'm very aware of the tyranny of communism. But I wouldn't call it. I mean, it's certainly a system I wouldn't wanna live under. I have family members who I still talk to regularly who are in Vietnam, who've never been able to, who've never immigrated over here to the United States, or they're not, they didn't ever, flee like the rest of my family, so half of them stayed there. And it is, they don't have free speech. There's a lot of stuff they don't have full freedom of. When I'm trying to talk to my cousins, we're the same age, and we have similar interests, and we would talk about politics, of course, because that's what I do for a living. And when the conversations gets to a certain point, my cousins would cut me off and say, "Okay, that's enough. We can't talk anymore," because the government could be watching and they might get in trouble for that. My grandfather was locked up in a re-education camp by the communists after the Vietnam War, and was in there for 4 years. So I have a very intimate knowledge of what it's like living under a communist regime, just from growing up with my family, sending money to my family in Vietnam, then my family finally being able to go over there and help my family more, and then to where my family is today, which is quite well off, actually. Now, Vietnam has turned around the same time that China did, when trade was able to be opened up, when business was allowed into Vietnam again. They thrived. What I witnessed, though, now my family doesn't think about like rescuing the rest of my Vietnamese family anymore. When they wanted to rescue them, it was because of the economic situation of my family stuck in Vietnam was terrible under I mean, the communists took our house. They took our family home. They split it up, and they made my aunt who stayed behind live in the basement of our family home. So I know really well like what this kind of situation is for people and how terrible it is. Um, but my family, we were very worried about the economic situation, they were just poor, and we were sending money all the time. Anytime we could send money over to Vietnam, we were sending money. But when trade opened up, it was a night and day difference for my family. They're still living under communism. They still don't have the free speech that I do today here in the United States. Somewhat, I wouldn't, the United States got some improvement to do, but certainly they're not as free. But we're not worried about them anymore, because they're economically doing well. We don't have to worry about them being able to feed themselves. I don't worry about my cousin's little kids who now can afford school and get good educations, and they do travel around. They don't come to the United States, but they go to Europe, they go to other parts of Asia, they travel, they have a good life. And it's because of that economic turnaround, even though they're still living under one of the only communist countries left in the world. So I guess, when we talk about like the human rights of it, the human rights are debilitating when you're poor. That is what people care more about, is the inability to feed themselves. So if I look at, China from a human rights perspective, really all I care about now is, as long as, I'm happy my family in Vietnam can eat, and they can have nice homes now, and I don't have to stress out about them. We don't stress. We don't send them money anymore. And that helps us as Americans here, not having to send our money away, right, to our family members who are suffering under U.S. sanctions. But the idea of we need to save people, I don't want to say, I don't feel like we should spend, and none of my Vietnamese family here believes we should spend an ounce of U.S. dollars or U.S. military might on rescuing the Vietnamese from the communists. We're like, let it go. They're strong. They'll figure it out. If they don't want to live under that anymore, they will rise up. They're perfectly capable. If they want to overturn their government, let them do it. We don't have to be the ones to facilitate it. We don't have to be the ones to fund it. We don't have to be the ones to egg it on or encourage it. I'm just worried about us here and how we're going to have a strong economy and thrive. So do we need to worry about overturning the Chinese Communist government? Do we really need to worry about that?
Absolutely, we do. Because not only because of its, again, gross human rights abuses, and your audience, of course, may have some familiarity with the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party and the fact that Mao engineered a famine, right? That Mao killed an estimated, a recent book estimated that as many as perhaps 42 million people died in the Great Famine, Mao's Great Famine between 1959 and about 1961, 1962. The tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party against the Chinese people themselves was incredibly brutal and one of the 20th century's worst human rights disasters. I think it's also important to recognize that legacy still remains. Yes, Shanghai is a beautiful city, to be sure. And so many cities, of course, but it's also built, there's a strong, if you will, divide between the rural population and the urban population.
Hmm.
So Shanghai is not indicative of China. It is the men who come to work, who leave their families in rural areas, who are doing backbreaking labor. We know the stories, of course, of Foxconn, of course, and the suicide nets, right? And the fact that the tyranny and the Dickensian, even worse than anything Dickens could imagine, conditions of those factories are quite common and in the Chinese economy. That brutality is made possible because of the regime, of the Chinese communist regime, that if businesses obviously need their permission,
Hmm.
and that regime is going to enforce, if you will, that Dickensian labor condition. So the Chinese people are suffering terribly today.
Yeah.
And that's not to say anything about Muslims. So the Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uyghur Muslim populations in Xinjiang are in concentration camps, right? I mean, that's today in the year 2024. You do, in fact, have concentration camps in China. And many, I think, in the audience may not be aware of that. So that matters for the Chinese people. It's going to matter for us because of, again, the aggression. That aggression directed against its own people is also outwardly directed. Their pressure on the Philippines, a U.S. ally, right? The pressure on Vietnam, not a U.S. ally, but a partner of
Yeah.
the U.S., on Taiwan, on Malaysia, on Japan. all are very important developments. The fact also that the People's Republic of China, declared a people's war against us in 2019. Right, that's a very important development, and in communist argot, that actually means something. When they declare people's war, that means they're focused on the United States as the enemy, and they're doing everything they can to mobilize for a war, a kinetic competition with the United States. The cyber, of course, the FBI Director Wray's statement, and then, of course, the reports that came out yesterday, February 7th, about how for up to 5 years, you'd had Chinese, essentially hackers, in U.S. infrastructure, right, to be able to target, of course, our electrical grid. And so things are going to heat up very quickly over Taiwan. And Xi Jinping is determined to resolve this issue. He's determined to conquer Taiwan, and that's going to affect Japan, the Philippines. It's going to affect the U.S. economy because of chip production, obviously, in Taiwan. And it's going to affect our interests in the Indo-Pacific area. So things are getting much worse very quickly, and that's driven by this regime and that particular leader, Xi Jinping. It's a very dangerous time, and it's getting worse. And that's important for the audience to understand. And of course, in the book, we're trying to explain how we got to this point.
Right. No, and I mean, and it's very comprehensive. I mean, it's a very intelligent, comprehensive book for sure. Like I said, whether I agree with certain points of it or not, and there are many points I do agree with, but let's get to okay, so and there's people watching right now who absolutely agree with you 100%. This has been a fascinating conversation. I do your book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, written by yourself as well as James Fennell, and the foreword written by Steve Bannon. And it is a very comprehensive book. I mean, very smart. You guys have laid it out very, very well. Like I said, a lot of books that are written are just kind of, they gloss the surface. They just say China bad or something, and then they don't really delve into it. And you really go very deep into the subjects, and I really appreciate it. I do recommend it. I personally will read the rest of it because I do like, I mean, it's important to have all of this information, I think. So thank you again for being here. Really appreciate your time.
It was my pleasure to join you. Thank you for the opportunity. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. All right, guys, thank you for joining us. That was an interesting conversation. We're limited on time for about an hour, and I didn't want to get into some of the debates. I know many of you who've watched my program for a long time know that I don't agree that there is a genocide going on in China with the Uyghurs. We don't really have any evidence of that besides just some, government officials telling us to believe that these satellite images of buildings are concentration camps and whatnot. So, and I know many of you disagree with my position on that, and you think that there is something really atrocious going on there. I'm one that needs evidence in order to believe something. So I need to see images. I need to see, and more than just satellite buildings saying, yes, trust us, there's something bad going on there. I need to see actual, real evidence. And when it comes to something like a genocide, look at what's going on in Palestine. There's overwhelming amounts of video and overwhelming amounts of imagery. You just can't deny what you're seeing because it's just there's millions of images at this point and videos and people. That is the type of stuff you end up seeing when there is a genocide going on. Even the Holocaust ended up having many more images, and that was in an era that didn't have the technology that we have today. And yet they still were able to capture quite a bit of the horrors that happened during the Holocaust. So when there's a lack of evidence this day and age, when there's so much internet and just the basics of, if people are undergoing something that atrocious, they flee, they run to borders, there's aid groups on the ground, like what we're seeing in Palestine. There's just a lot more going on than just the rumors that we've been hearing out of China. Now, you can choose to believe those. And maybe it is happening. I'm not saying totally it isn't. I'm just saying I haven't seen any evidence of it. So because of that, I don't believe that. So I didn't push back on that point because that's not what this conversation was about. This conversation was about something bigger, the threat of China as a whole and what we should do about that. And so that's why some of the points I chose not to get into it with Mr. Thayer on, or Dr. Thayer actually, for these, just because it's just not the time. At a different time, we can have those conversations, maybe with somebody else who really wants to dive into that. But I thought this was a really good conversation and very fascinating. The book is very well written. It is one of the best I've come across as far as the information, the intelligence. It's very comprehensive. Like I said, I don't agree with a lot of it, but that's okay. I think it's really important. Now, many of you do agree, and so get your hands on the book, and then you can read it and shore up your arguments. For those of us that don't agree, I think it's really important to know what the arguments are, because I do think that our military-industrial complex is trying to march us into another conflict, and I would like to know what their arguments are. So I think it's important to know all sides of everything, and this is well done, well written, and I appreciate him coming on the show, knowing full well that it was going to be a bit of a debate. So I appreciate that. All right, guys, that is it for today's show. Thank you so much for joining us.